So let's move on now. Having emphasized this dimension, the originality of this dimension of the realization of the subject, of the future anterior, let's move on now to the notion that I think is also really crucial in function and field, and that is that law is, in some respects, language. Law, in some respects, is language. So, in the second part of function and field, Lacan develops a distinctive psychoanalytic account of why law is always underpinned by language. The law of man, he says, effectively is always the law of language. He does some interesting references here to a whole series of anthropological sources. And one of the places he begins in thinking about law as being instantiated within language is the work of Maurice Leonhardt. And Leonhardt has this idea that for certain cultures, particularly he has in mind the Pacific Argonauts, gifts, and here I quote, gifts, the act of giving them and the objects given, their transmutation into signs, and even their fabrication were all closely intertwined with speech. So that's Lacan. So what we're talking about here is a conjunction of a series of ideas: gifts, exchange, symbolization. Gifts, symbolization, exchange, and ultimately law. So let's see if we can open that up again, take it step by step. We could say then that what's important to realize and register here is the primacy of gift giving in certain cultures, presumably all human cultures, and what that does, the process of gift giving, in the making of a symbolic bond. Now, because I've been talking about anticipatory temporality, I'm going to do a little stealing of a quote from the future. And Paul Verhaag, in his own commentary on function and field, makes a nice, concise formulation, which I will try to develop a little bit more. But this is what he says. Based on Levi-Strauss and Marcel Mauss, Lacan suggests that language means exchange and that exchange means law in the most fundamental meaning of that word. What is given is less important than the process of exchange itself, because the fact of giving and receiving determines a recognition. Every one of us functions within a symbolically determined system of exchanges that determines every possible relationship. And this occurs even before someone opens his or her mouth. Language imposes a symbolically determined system of exchange in a structure of kinship in which every individual speaker is assigned his or her position. This never-ending exchange has to do with a fundamental debt. The symbol is the mode of the thing. Okay, so that's the end of that quote. We'll try and develop that a little bit, but clearly we're hearing a lot about exchange, but we're also getting a sense here about how the symbolic order is in some respects built up, perpetuated, performed, enacted via forms of exchange, which bring with them a question of a debt. And this question of a debt, I suppose, implies once again the dimension of the future, but it also implies some agency, some movement within the system, some debt, some owing of the subject. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about law. One of my own personal projects, I think, in trying to deal with early Lacan is to get the sense of the profound interconnection of law in language and how the symbolic operates. And this, I think, is so crucial because often in shorthand uses of Lacanian, we see symbolic order being equated with the contents of a language or a culture. And of course, you can see how that happens because, there's this famous notion, Lacan says, symbolic is the treasury of the signifier, or the big other is the treasury of the signifier. But of course, the crucial element there, it's the treasury of the signifier, not of signifieds. But nonetheless, I think it's a kind of routine error that we often think of, or people utilize the symbolic order as a kind of collection of signifieds. And here's where I think Levi-Strauss and his reference to the stomach, which I love, is so important. Why do I say that? The symbolic order is not equivalent to what is socially constructed. The symbolic order is a type of operating system which is essentially contentless. It has no essential subject matter. It possesses no materials. And the same is true of the unconscious approached via Levi-Strauss's instructive suggestion that the unconscious is always empty. It is as much a stranger to the images that pass through it as the stomach is to the food which passes through it. This contentless nature of the symbolic order is nicely stressed by Muller and Richardson, and they're not here today, but I brought their book along, who likewise call attention to how the operation of the symbolic order encompasses more than language in its verbal and written forms. This is their little summary of one of these points, which I think is helpful. The symbolic order, they say, conceived as law, governs not only the order of language, but the logic of mathematical combination, and indeed the whole pattern of social relatedness that emerges under the guise of marriage ties, kinship relationships, forms of exchange, superimposing the kingdom of culture on that of nature. Okay, end of the quote. In other words, the symbolic order produces a range of structuring laws by virtue of how it works, which is precisely on the basis of a combinatorial logic. And there's multiple different combinatorial logics, but of course, within language, grammar would be the most obvious one. And also, crucially, for Lacan and various other linguists, metaphor and metonymy. This is one of those moments in Function and Field where Lacan is saying something that will emerge again, in this case, 11 years later, in Seminar 11, which is not here either, but the book is here, where Lacan will still take up this point, emphasizing that the priority for psychoanalysis lies with, and here I quote him, the combinatorial operation, functioning spontaneously in a pre-subjective way. It is this linguistic structure that gives its status to the unconscious. Okay, so there we're getting a different view and quite a profound view of how the operations of language, I mean, this is basic structuralism really, but how the operations of language bring with them a kind of law. Back, though, to Lacan's engagement with anthropology and with Maurice Leonhardt. Lacan asks us, is it with these gifts or with the passwords that sometimes come with gifts that give them their salutary non-meaning? Is it thus that language begins along with the law? Is it, in other words, by means of gift-giving, the capacity to abstract things from their primary use value, that properly symbolic and law instantiating behaviors, and more importantly yet, language, really begin? So we've said a lot, which seems to suggest that the answer is maybe a tentative yes, because exchanges inform, hold in place, enact the symbolic order at some level. And as Lacan will emphasize, gifts seem always ready to function as kind of rudimentary symbols, as almost para-symbolic in a sense. And we know this because symbolic value clearly outweighs practical value. Gifts that are given are often functionally useless, but have an important signification. So, bearing in mind, this is Lacan of the 50s, we are led to a conclusion that there is a certain neutralization by means of the signifier. Pacification might be a better word here. That is, there is the establishment of pacts, laws, and social relations made possible by symbolization. Is this the underlying basis of language itself? This seems to be the underlying basis of certain symbolic operations, and it's clearly crucial, but this is not the underlying basis of language itself. And it is at this point, I mean, maybe what I've said sounds a little rudimentary, a little bit introductory in terms of Lacanian basic theory, but here's where things get a little bit more challenging. It's not simply enough to have a system of exchanges and the rudimentary symbolization that goes along with those exchanges to be the basis of human language. Why? Well, Lacan gives one of his odd ethological observations here. He says, some of you will be familiar with the example, sea swallows pass fish to one another from beak to beak. There seems to be some kind of exchange, but it's going to always fall short of language. Why is that? Well, we can already guess and say that given that Lacan is so informed and inspired by structural linguistics, we know that language involves a differential system of signifiers. So we know that, but let's go through Lacan's reasoning here. Are words capable of symbolism? No, says Lacan. There's something else that completes the symbol, that makes language of it. Paul Verhaeghe makes a very nice comment here. He says that in many moments in Function and Field, it would be more accurate to translate what Lacan is calling a symbol as a signifier. So if we were to do that, we would, and I'm just rolling back a few seconds. No, says Lacan, there's something else that completes the signifier, making language of it. What then is it that makes a prospective signifier, be it an object of exchange or a gift, effective as a unit of language? It's not simply the fact that we're dealing with sound, the materiality of the signifier, with verbal exclamations. It's not that alone. That's important. What effectively makes a signifier operate in a properly linguistic manner is not simply the fact that it's become disconnected from any immediate relationship to the signified. Okay, that's like Lacan 101, we got that. Signifiers don't fundamentally refer to signifiers, they refer to other signifiers, and the effect of that is to give us a signified. But there's some other level to Lacan's reasoning here. The signifying element of the signifier has to signify the very disconnection from the signified. It has to instantiate an absence. And this is the theme that kind of made me a little bit anxious, but excited. A signifier needs to instantiate an absence. The word, says Lacan, is a presence made absence. Okay, and the word is a presence made absence. What does this mean? It means that a signifier doesn't just become disconnected from the signified in the way that that structural linguistics had suggested. The signifier somehow needs to mark the very fact of its disconnection. What does Lacan do now? He's got this little formula. We have a signifier as the presence made absence, and he does the thing that he does, and he turns to Freud, and he turns to the famous Fort-da game. Now, we all remember this. There's a little child who, in a series of acts which join signifiers and actions, throws away a little cotton reel, says, "Fort, gone," before retrieving it, uttering the word da, there. In this way, the child not only symbolizes the comings and goings of the mother, says Lacan, but also symbolizes the very fact of symbolization itself. In this way, here's a quote from Lacan, "From this articulated couple of presence and absence, language's world of meaning is born." Right, so it's often around here that headaches start to emerge. So I don't know if you've got a headache yet, but don't worry. We'll make your headache worse. So one little call out to the future is the far later subsequent Lacanian notion of the unary trace. And without going into that too much, you could try to parse it as this idea that there are moments in the symbolic life of human culture where one is involved in the act of making a mark on the wall. The mark on the wall is not necessarily representational. Rather, it's a manifestation of its own artificiality. So let's just keep that in mind. Again, sounds a little bit abstract. We'll try and develop that. When we think about the unary trace, or part of what Lacan seems to be articulating here, and for me, this is something I don't see elsewhere in other social theories. I think it's very much a Lacanian emphasis. We're talking about a theory of signifierness. The unary trace, the making of a mark, is sometimes not representational. It's about the marking which manifests the realm of artificiality, the symbolic mark which differentiates itself from the world of objects and also the world of representational links to the world of objects. We're going to give a couple of examples of this, and we're going to talk briefly about Chinese writing. Having taken us into a moment of theory which he doesn't seem to have properly clarified, Lacan, in a characteristic move, makes things more complicated rather than less. And his arguments concerning the vacillation of absence and presence in the making of language, still being somewhat unclear, he now throws another example, citing the co-mantics of China, by which I think he's referring to the origins of Chinese writing. And I don't know if any of this is correct, actually. I'm very much indebted to Mark de Kessel, who has formulated some of these ideas. Let's see if we can, now that I've thrown poor Mark under the bus, let's see if we can make something of it. In speaking of the origin of Chinese writing, and I'm hoping that someone can share that on the chat, there's a little document which shows up these co-mantics of China. We see a series of characters, each of which consists of 3 bars, which can be distinguished from others according to how their respective bars are broken up. So it's a kind of rudimentary, well, rudimentary is not necessarily the right word, but it's a series of inscriptions, a series of marks, which do not function by virtue of being representational. They are not merely substitutes or replacements for items in the world. And this is evident given that their arrangement in different combination produces meanings rather than any one-to-one correspondence with objects. This quality sets these signifiers apart from any objects in the world. This is their signifierness, or to go back to the phrase that Lacan was using before, this is their ability to engender an absence by virtue of their presence. They're definitively not what they signify. They engender an absence, and yet they do signify something. They engender a presence. They thus make meaning possible. And we could say it's the very how of this break with reality, the fact of their minimal combinatorial differences, which proves to be the crucial distinguishing element of each such character. What we then start to approach is the idea that language operates as an operational differential system through which almost everything in principle can be signified. There's a finite set of letters or differentiated sounds which can be arranged in an infinite set of ways to produce a non-ending series of significations. And this is what I think we are talking about when, or Lacanians are, when they talk about signifierness.